Thank you very much, Myrne. I'm not going to say a lot this morning because I said enough last night. It's lovely to be back. I feel we're experiencing reeling in the centuries this morning because we've had a fascinating overview there of a great battle for freedom in the 19th century. And I tried to reflect last night on what freedom might have meant for the revolutionary generation in Ireland in the early 20th century. And this morning we're going to talk about what freedom might mean to us in the early 21st century. And when we consider those words, Irish freedom, they will mean different things to different people. We can think about the political side of freedom, what constitutes freedom, the social perhaps, the cultural, the linguistic, the economic. There are a whole host of different angles. But for many, Irish freedom as a description, as a rallying call, as a cry, was very much associated with Irish nationalism. And if you consider a book, for example, that was published about 10 years ago by Richard English, who was then the Professor of Politics in Queen's University, Belfast, it was entitled Irish Freedom, and it was a broad, sweeping history of Irish nationalism. And I remember talking to him about that book, and there was never any question of what the title was going to be. It seemed to be the title that fitted the long history of Irish nationalism. And that's what it has been most associated with. And there were, of course, personal journeys of Irish freedom that were later written about, including one of the most famous, Dan Breen's My Fight for Irish Freedom, which became a bestseller in the late 1920s, not long after the end of that phase of the Irish fight for freedom. And in more recent times, as I was trying to talk about last night, I think there's been a tendency to subject that description of Irish freedom to a more sustained and perhaps critical analysis. If you consider the recent work of historians like Charles Townsend, for example, when they look at the revolutionary era and they talk about self-determination, which of course was another rallying cry from the early 20th century, not just in an Irish context, but in a much broader international context. And Townsend makes the point that not many who were using that particular description thought too much about what it meant in practice. They didn't analyse, as he put it, the self in self-determination. And that's what I mean, I suppose, about a more critical analysis being brought to bear on it. And again, where are we now in relation to that, in relation to what we associate the description Irish freedom with? Is it still the case that Irish freedom is still bound up with notions of Irish nationalism? Or are there other definitions, more relevant definitions, that will resonate in the early 21st century? And how do we deal, I suppose, with the idea that, as I mentioned last night, one person's freedom can be another's subjugation? So there are a whole load of lenses, I suppose, we could look through in relation to power and the struggle for freedom and the role of community in that, and the way in which that has manifested itself in the past and might manifest itself in the future. So what we're about broadly this morning is trying to get a perspective from our distinguished guests on what freedom might mean to them. And I want to keep this as informal as possible. So we will stay where we are in our seats. And obviously a very important part of this school is your own contribution. So I do want to open this discussion up to the floor because I think it's important that there's dialogue between us all here in relation to freedom. I feel like John Bowman sitting down here. This is like questions and answers in the good old days of current affairs. So I might just start with that point about your own definitions of freedom. Fiach, do you want to begin in relation to how you might define freedom in the early 21st century, or what this title means to you?
I've no idea. I mean, I suppose that's the the challenging point about the title. So, I'm director of the Abbey Theatre, and I've been director for over 10 years. And the constant interrogation or exploration I have, Dermot, is about the audience, who's coming to the Abbey Theatre, where is the Abbey going in terms of touring, what's the demographic, what's preventing people from coming. I mean, we've well over 120,000 people who come to the Abbey every year, and we realise, of course, that the first thing I did early on, it was thinking that price of a ticket was the major obstacle to come and see great work or interesting work or challenging work. And of course, I suddenly realised, well, after a couple of years, that actually wasn't the case. Price is never an obstacle necessarily, particularly when we have quite low prices. So, I started looking at the work we do on our local communities, who's living in our local communities, and of course we had bankers living in our local community, but we also had quite a lot of young communities, disadvantaged communities, new communities, and we had a local school, an extraordinary school in Champions Avenue called the Larkin Community College. And I'm going to come to the answer to your question shortly, but the Larkin Community College, I don't know the exact statistics, but certainly something like 30% of the parents of those children, English isn't their first language. And they come from all kind of places like Albania, Estonia, China, Philippines, Ukraine, Poland. And I began to engage with them. Particularly, there's a quite a visionary teacher there called Mario Higgins, who about how we might engage with those pupils and how we might give them access to the Abbey Theatre, but without it being about lip service. And that's where the notion of citizenship came about. And I was very interested in that word and the notion of what that meant. And of course, in my view, citizenship is absolutely connected with freedom. It's about the notion of freedom of thought, freedom of access to everything from health, education, housing, culture expression, diverse views, access to history, access to information, and how to be critical about the information you're given. And we started to develop a junior cert short course called Theatre and Citizenship, in that the notion of coming to the National Theatre as an expression of your freedom, but expression of your intellectual right should be shouldn't be just about a passive reception of what you see on stage, which should be a critical engagement. And I suddenly realised, of course, that that critical engagement has to happen across all strata of society, and that one of the key obstacles to that is poverty, and that that unless, and as we emerge, of course, we were quite aware of the housing crisis, and the housing crisis, in a sense, underlines the poverty crisis, and particularly young people, and particularly children. And there's a lot of children. I know Dublin better than other cities. A lot of children who are going to school hungry still, and who therefore immediately their access to freedom, cultural expression in the widest sense, and what I mean by that too is information and access to services, understanding of their own identity. And I began then to get completely paranoid, Dermot, by looking at all kinds of things like the rewriting of the curriculum, our increasing disengagement. That was fascinating this morning, because I never heard of Peter Lalor, and I'm glad I was here to hear that. That's empowered me in one way. It's kind of realised that, reinventing the wheel is something that we constantly do. But if I haven't heard of Peter Lalor, and I would call myself a reasonably sophisticated, well-read person, what are the chances of current 12, 13-year-olds understanding who the seven signatories were, their own access to history, the teaching of history? So I also realised, of course, that those gorgeous, amazing young people who were 12, 13, 14 in first and second year in Larkin Community College also had no damage done to them with regards to Shakespeare or Shaw or Synge or O'Casey. And what I mean by that is it wasn't beaten into them. They probably never heard them. So, and also and one of the challenges in terms of their own culture expression is around oracy. All right, how to speak, how to actually, how to put frankly, put two sentences together in a way, and these are extraordinarily bright people. So we took them in to see plays. We took them to see Shakespeare and Shaw and work in the Peacock and work in the Abbey. And they had no sense and no prejudices around the engagement with language and the gulping back of ideas. And even if those ideas, some of them they might never understand, and often I don't understand until later what Shakespeare or Shaw meant. But the point we made is over time, over a particular year, they engaged with the work. They went backstage. They were able to walk from Champions Avenue, which is like 3 minutes away from the Abbey, and walk through the front doors of the Abbey Theatre with confidence and gorgeous arrogance, and come up to me and give out to me or explain to me what they felt. And by the end of the year, they had to stand up in front of their class and the school and give a critique of a particular play they saw on the stage. So my small story here is that the notion for me, the definition for me of Irish freedom today is about how can we assess and measure access to health, education, housing, fair wage, cultural expression, in a way that allows our young citizens of today to become fully capable of actively involving themselves in the emerging Ireland of the 21st century. And I think we are slightly more regressive than we were 100 years ago there. I think the notion that, yes, there's a lot of information available, a huge amount. Access to information is there, but not necessarily the signposts and not necessarily the sense of critical analysis. And you can see, and my final point, again, I don't want to sound either paranoid but you can see how the pressure on third level education and third level teaching, particularly in the humanities, around a critical awareness, a development of critical analysis, so that we have a growing, not just dependent on the brilliant Diarmaid Ferter or Declan Kibert or Katrina Crowe, in terms of public intellectuals, and the pressure becomes that the narrowing of critical engagement, a critical debate, and therefore more and more kind of inspirational voices, so that the young people of Larkin Community College can start to make a difference in their new communities, and that's something that concerns me.
Thanks a lot.